All right. Hey, everyone. Hey, this is a really full room. Thanks for coming to this panel, How to Build an Arcade Cabinet. I just want to explain what's going to happen so that everyone knows there's going to be an actual arcade cabinet construction in the front happening while we're doing this panel. So we apologize in advance for the drilling or sawdust. But you guys should be fine. We did a lot of the work in advance. And hammering. There will be hammering.
We haven't done this before, so it might be cool or it might be terrible.
Yeah, we're not sure.
This is like the test, so we'll see how it goes.
So we'll just introduce ourselves. My name is Marquee. I run a nonprofit in New York called Death by Audio Arcade. I'm a fabricator, and I build things for a living.
Hi, I'm Andy Wallace. I'm a game designer and professor also in New York and a board member of Death by Audio Arcade.
And I'm Dustin Long, also from New York. I'm a software developer, and I make games. And I'm also a board member of Death by Audio Arcade.
Yeah, you're a board member.
Hello, and I'm Jonah Wellerstein, also from New York, and I am the creator of Kung Fu Kickball.
Woo!
I'm Kyle Magos. I do run through the games, Scoop Hooch down there, that's mine. I'm a software developer from Pittsburgh, and I guess a Death by Audio adjunct of sorts at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alan Riley. I'm a video artist. I made the game Video Freak, which you can check out in the Indie Arcade, Video Arcade. And, I also learned how to make arcade cabinets from these people. So I'm proof that you can do this.
All right. So you guys can get started.
Yeah.
We're going to run through this presentation, and there's going to be a lot of stuff. So at any point, if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. We'll also take questions at the end, so you can feel free to wait. But if you have specific questions about like wood or paint or something, just shout it out, and we'll take care of it.
What's wood?
Oh man, we'll get there.
All right.
All right. So. Go ahead.
Who's
Yeah,
talking?
so just to kind of give a very quick primer on Death by Audio Arcade. This is an arcade group. You can find a lot of our games downstairs on the arcade floor, obviously, and it all started when Mark was living at the venue Death by Audio and was building arcade machines to live in this DIY audio space.
Yeah, so I think our name incites a lot of confusion into people. So just as a background, there was a music venue in New York for 10 years called Death by Audio. It started because one of the founding members, listed here, Oliver Ackerman, built guitar pedals and named the company Death by Audio. And then after a while, to help pay the rent, they invited bands in to play in this warehouse space, and it became a music venue for a long time. And the really cool thing about this was, in addition to having this pedal company and music venue, there was also a loft space where 13 artists and makers lived in the back. And there was a wood shop there was screen printing, and there was a lot of opportunity to build things. So I moved in here in 2009, and the next year I started reading about MAME Cabinet builds. And there's a lot of information on forums and online about setting up emulators, setting up ROMs and launchers and things like that, and how to wire up buttons and joysticks. So this was the first cabinet that I made, and this lived in Death by Audio for a couple years.
Yeah, so after Death by Audio was shut down, we've started sort of going around the city, showing arcade cabinets at different places in the city. The city in this instance is New York City, which is why we don't have like one big space, because no one can afford rent. So instead, we just ferry these different machines all around and to different events, and in the process, we've met a lot of other artists and game designers, and we just sort of Katamari them up. And like, how many machines do we have now, Dustin?
Arcade cabinets is like 12-ish, I think, depending upon what you count.
And then a number of physical installations, some of which are here. Yeah, well, not yet.
Not
soon,
yet.
soon.
Well, it's like 12.2.
Yeah, and so just a few of the places we've shown.
2.1.
A few of the places we've shown things are at Maker Faire, the Low Levels Festival, the Smithsonian American Museum of Art, MAGFest, obviously, and although our permanent collection is about 12, maybe 13, we're not totally sure. I think we've built around 25 cabinets.
And so, as we've been traveling around, we've done a lot of partnerships with venues in New York. So last year, every month, we did a different partnership with a different place. And so we've been sort of kind of curating these events. And since we're kind of nomadic, we've been building less cabinets. This is our first one since 2016. But we've done a lot of smaller installations, as well as we did an alt control inspired event where we built alternative interfaces and other types of games.
We did build the Dreambox last year.
We did build the Dreambox. That was a special commission for an LGBT venue in New York.
It's a beautiful mirrored arcade cabinet.
And in 2016, we became a 501c3. So now we have memberships for people in New York that can get discounts on tickets to our events. We accept donations through a platform called With Friends. Or if you want to donate, just you can come and talk to us. We'll accept any kinds of donations. And next year we have plans to have some new events
This
at
year.
Oh yeah, this is this year.
It's
We're in 2019. We made it. At a venue called Secret Project Robot that's starting next week.
Yeah, so one of the first things, if you're talking about building an arcade cabinet, obviously, is thinking about what game is even going to go in the arcade cabinet. And we find, we kind of come at this from two different ways. Sometimes the game is built around the arcade cabinet. It was always meant to be an arcade game, and the affordance of the arcade is part of what makes the game that game. Other times, and probably a little more frequently, I'd say, there's a game that already exists, and we're like, oh, this would be a great thing to put in an arcade cabinet.
I feel like not everything is a perfect fit for the arcade cabinet. It depends upon just, how easy it is to approach. But, some games are just like natural fits.
Yeah, and there's a lot of games that are like brilliant games, but maybe not perfect for the arcade. There's a whole set of criteria that we really keep in mind when thinking about games to put in arcade. Like, is it approachable? Can I learn how to play this just by watching someone else play it for like 60 seconds? Am I going to have to learn a lot of stuff? How many buttons does it take? If you need a joystick and like 16 buttons to play, it might not be a perfect fit. But if the game is simple, if it's fast, if it's collaborative, especially if it has like kind of moments of excitement where everyone yells a lot, those are all things that suggest a game that might be a super good fit for an arcade machine.
Yeah, so in March of 2018, we had an open call for local multiplayer games in New York. We had an event where we showcased 10 games. And some of the games that we featured there are here at the MIVS showcase. Kung Fu Kickball was one of those games. Zarvot was another one of those games. Red Hot Ricochet was another one. And there were 10 really amazing games. And so we didn't tell the developers, but we kind of knew in the back of our minds that one of these games would become our next arcade cabinet. And so that was sort of our intention with that event.
And basically a year later, here we are.
These things take time.
So we chose Kung Fu Kickball. Jonah, why don't you tell us about Kung Fu Kickball?
Sure. So I actually made Kung Fu Kickball with sort of an arcade in mind. Like I really wanted to see it as an arcade machine. So that's part of the reason why I made sure to keep the buttons as few as possible. I actually really only wanted 2 buttons at first, but then like this third move it really needed. So I sacrificed and added that third button, but I think I still kept it pretty tight. But yeah, so I was really inspired by, arcade cabinets you guys have built and like seeing other friends' games at conventions like this and seeing people like really enjoying playing together. And so I wanted to make something that was easy to pick up and like got people yelling like you were saying. So I'm really happy to like finally see it become the cabinet I envisioned from the beginning.
The first time I played Kung Fu Kickball was last year at MAGFest. And I think a lot of the DBAA members were like, this would be a great cabinet. Like, we all kind of talked about it at MAGFest, and then we realized, like, I didn't even know you were from New York, so that kind of, like, made all of this a lot easier in the end.
For sure.
Once we decided, when we had to start kind of designing what this was going to look like, there's a lot of traditional cabinet designs online, and so Jonah and I, we kind of went through, and Kyle, picking how tall we wanted it to be, how wide we wanted it to be. We've done 2-player cabs and 4-player cabs, and the difference is that you can't really squeeze 4 people into like a console. that's not like extended out to the sides. So we knew we had to have a detachable console that's shown up here so that 4 people could stand around.
The console is the part in front with the buttons and joysticks on it. I didn't know that when I started doing this. So for anyone who's not familiar with the jargon.
Also, we decided, because Kyle was in Pittsburgh and I was in New York, that we were going to build this cabinet in 2 parts and bring it together. So Kyle built the sides and basically the cabinet box, and I worked on the electronics and the joystick button console. So we're putting this together for the first time here. So this is just kind of a really abridged list of tools and materials. This is what we used. Yes?
Can you just have the slides if we give addresses to send to?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll put it on our website at the end of this. So we did this by cutting the cabinet sides out of wood. We're going to run the game on a computer. We're using drills and saws to cut the wood. We painted the wood. We're using wire to wire all the buttons together, and we use a soldering iron, which is how you can attach wires to electrical components to wire those up. We're going to go through this whole process. Wood glue is helpful. Sawhorses are helpful. We're basically kind of piecing it all together. So whenever we start with the wood. We like to use plywood for our cabinets. A lot of people choose to use MDF. The difference is plywood are pieces of wood, really thin, that are laminated together into a stack, and there's a piece of plywood. We used 1/2-inch thick plywood, although you can use 3/4-inch thick plywood, which makes the cabinet a lot heavier. If you play particle mace, it's made out of 3/4-inch plywood, and it's very heavy. MDF is basically, yes, question in the back.
Do you use like grade A or birch veneer or regular like CDX?
CDX is bad. CDX is like, it's what you make like frames for houses out of, with like kind of all the pieces glued together.
That work a lot.
Yeah.
It's like if they use CDX, they would have to like skim coat it for hours and hours.
Yeah. Kyle, do you know what kind of wood you got?
So this is not the grade A. It's this is from Home Depot. It's the like sandy plywood.
Okay. So it's just probably like the B grade stuff.
Yeah. By and large, that's fine. There's a couple places where so like the piece that goes on the screen, wherever I put that, I hit a couple voids while I was working on it.
Yeah.
That I had to like patch up, and it cost me a couple hours of just like fixing that plywood.
Yes.
So for like all the big panels like this, whatever, it's fine. There's a couple like nicer pieces that you might want to use a nicer piece of plywood, but by and large, cheap stuff's fine. It's not too cheap.
Also, if you go to Home Depot, you can usually get plywood that's sanded on one side, so there's a nice finish on one side and not as nice on the other, so you can save a little bit of cash, and then you just turn all the bad sides inward, and the nice finish is on the exterior. We've done that too. There are a lot of people who use MDF, which is just compressed sawdust that's glued together. It's really terrible to cut because it creates like a lot of dust with toxins in it, so if you use MDF, you kind of have to wear a dust mask. Plywood, I just find is easier to screw into. Also, if MDF gets wet, it kind of disintegrates a little bit. So we like plywood in general. The reason that this slide exists is because when you buy plywood, it is sold in 4-foot by 8-foot sheets. So you have to kind of decide how you're going to take your 3D model and explode it into a number of pieces that will fit onto these 4 feet by 8-foot panels. Kyle was able to get all of his pieces onto 2 sheets. Typically, we've been able to do about 3 sheets per cabinet. And a sheet is it could be between $30 and $75, depending on the quality of the plywood. Since I did the console, this was able to fit on 2 sheets, since it's only the cabinet sides and interior. So then the next step after you kind of map out your pieces is cutting the plywood. And so there are 2 kinds of saws that are used for this process. One is a circular saw. A circular saw is shown in this photo. It's a saw that's handheld, and the blade is a circle. and it's really good for cutting straight lines in wood. The second saw is a jigsaw. Jigsaw is a really thin blade, and you can sort of make curved cuts with it. So we'll show you in the next slide what that looks like. But first, we have to cut these big sheets into the individual pieces. And so saw horses, which are supports that you can set the wood on top of so you can cut it, those are really helpful. Kyle also has this method where he got some foam and put it on the ground underneath as sort of like a material that he can just cut into while he's cutting. And that works just as well.
You can see the foam in that picture there on the left
pink
one.
foam. Once you've got your pieces, then it's time to sketch out the cabinet sides. Every cabinet that we've built starts with the sides. The sides are kind of the profile. It's how you're designing your art. And so usually all the pieces fit together within the two side pieces. Now, one thing we ran into early on with building cabinets is we would draw a side, we would cut it, and then we kind of trace it and try to cut it again. But it's really difficult to get identical pieces with a jigsaw. You'll almost never be able to cut an identical piece freehand twice. So there's a couple methods of dealing with that. What Kyle did on this project was he clamped the first side piece to a second piece of plywood and used a router, which is kind of a high-powered drill, to kind of ride along the edge of that to get an identical second piece. If you have a router, this works really well. I clamp two pieces of plywood together and use the jigsaw to cut them both out at the same time, and that way you get two identical side pieces. One thing to keep in note, if you have just one finished side, you have to make sure that you orient them so that your nice sides face outward. Otherwise, you might have one backwards. And then something else that should be done early on in the process is cutting this slot. So T-molding, and maybe I'll just kind of open up a new window. There it is. So there's T-molding. It's a plastic lining that you would probably see on any arcade cabinet if you walk around the arcade.
You can also run your finger along the edge of the table you're in front of, and that's T-molding.
Yeah.
Is it?
It's just a wide one.
Super thick, but yeah.
So this is really nice because you don't want these like rough plywood edges. So in order to install this, you need to cut a slot into the edge of the plywood. And so this is done with a router. And so, Kyle, did you do this with a hand router or a table router?
Hand router.
Hand router?
I have not used this with a router table.
So basically, you would run this slot cutter along the edge just to make sure you have a slot that this can press into. Then we have this shot. This is sort of when all the pieces are cut out, and we're just sort of looking at the size of them. This is about, what, 5'8"? 5'10"?
Yeah, something like that. We can measure one.
Yeah. The original design came out a little bit shorter, and we were towering over it, and we decided to do the design again. So I like this step because you can sort of get a feel for how this is going to look. Like, what's the width? What's the height? Does this feel right? Before you get too deep into the process. And then we can start screwing it together. So the way that this was done was that we took 1x2 pieces of wood. You can also buy those at Home Depot. And you screw them into the insides of the side pieces. And these are support pieces for the interior panels to screw onto. We've done a lot of cabinets where we've just screwed plywood directly into another sheet of plywood, and that's just a super weak joint. The screws don't hold. Sometimes the plywood cracks. This is a much more sturdy way of doing it. One thing to keep in mind is that, plywood's a 1/2 inch thick, so you can't just line these up to the edge, otherwise your panels are going to stick out from the cabinet. So those have to be measured. And then you screw them on. So we use wood screws. These are 1.25 inches long. And if you go to a hardware store, Home Depot, and you ask for wood screws or drywall screws, they're sometimes called, then these have a point at the end, which is really important because if they don't have a point, you can't screw them into the wood. Pre-drill holes that are smaller than the wood with a drill bit in advance. That way you don't split it when you're adding the screw, and you screw it together. We're using a Phillips bit, which is like the cross. I don't know how granular we need to get with this.
Detail.
But yeah, you can also use other screws. I think you guys are using star bit.
These are star drives.
Yeah, there's lots of different bits. We can get into that, but that's a lot of stuff.
Keep going.
All right. The screen is a more difficult part to mount. I've done this in the past with just using a piece of plexiglass and kind of masking it off. Kyle opted to use plywood, and both situations work fine. To cut out a hole in the center of a piece of plywood can be kind of difficult. The method that I find works the best is you drill a pretty sizable hole in each corner, and then you can use that jigsaw piece to kind of go around and cut out that interior rectangle. And this is sized for the interior of the screen. We don't like to see the kind of plastic around the screen, so this will just show the actual LCD.
Question?
How do you choose the screen?
That's an excellent question. Many of our games are a 16:9 landscape orientation. So we have a screen that works really well. It has what's called a Visa mount in the back, which are 4 threaded inserts, which means you could just screw something directly to the screen, and it supports it really nicely. Dustin has a game called Star Versus that we built a cabinet for.
And it's using a CRT because it's kind of like a retro style game that runs on the NES. It makes it look really unique and different, but it's very heavy and difficult to transport, and has problems when you're trying to connect it to HDMI instead. So, like if you want to project it. So it's a fun choice, but not necessarily worth the costs.
Yeah.
And Particle Mace has a vertical screen because we didn't know what we were doing yet.
I think some games work better with a portrait orientation. Some work better with landscape. It really depends on the game. A lot of the games that we use now. I'm sorry. Was there another question?
I wanted to ask, where do you source your screens from?
It varies. Screens I tend to find on Craigslist because we're sometimes just looking for a certain size screen, and they're really cheap on Craigslist. We've bought new screens for like $120 on Amazon or at like Best Buy or something like that. There's a screen by BenQ that we've used a lot. That's about a 27-inch diagonal, and that works pretty well for most of our games. Some like purists who want to build like an 80s style cabinet might opt for a CRT. It's like the square kind of 4:3 ratio. Those are pretty easy to come by.
Craigslist as well.
Yeah. Other questions about screens? On this particular build, and we've done this a few times, the Visa mount wasn't perfect, so we decided not to use it. And so Kyle made this kind of bracket system where the screen is kind of sandwiched between a couple pieces of wood. And this had to be sized a few times in advance. So yeah, if you hold that up, Kyle, you could see like the back of the screen doesn't have any mounting holes, which is actually kind of rare. A lot of screens, just kind of do that. And where did you get this one?
It came from Micro Center
Micro Center.
because it was cheap.
How much was it? Do you know offhand? We have a price list at the end.
I'd say it was 130 maybe.
Yeah. Generally like between 100 and 150 for a new screen. But you can get them cheaper on Craigslist if you want to go that way.
Do you have a preference over computer monitors for TVs, or is it just whatever's available?
Mostly computer monitors. TVs tend to be a little bit bigger and heavier and have like a lot of superfluous stuff that you don't need. We only use one input, and it's important for us that when the cabinet gets powered on, the screen also goes on. So some TVs you have to use a remote to turn them on, which for an installation is really it's not ideal because you don't want to have an extra step for the cabinet. You just want to plug it in, it boots up automatically.
The easier to set up and run the cab, the better. In the back?
How do you guys mount your CRTs?
It's a similar system where there's pieces of wood to kind of hold it in place at the right angle and parts on the side to keep it in place so it won't move too much. It only goes so far. At some point, the TV could move if you're transporting it and it shakes too much and things break. But you do your best.
Yeah, we actually talked about rebuilding Star Versus because after a few years of transporting it, the CRT is just such a lot of weight in the cabinet that it's caused a lot of the joints to kind of weaken. So I think we're going to rebuild it with heavier wood in the future. But yes.
A quick question. So like sometimes like the bezel of like the monitor, it'll create a bit of space. So how do you like kind of like hide that? Because I'm sure like with like the mounting of like the monitor, it'll poke out a little bit, creating like half an inch of space. You see bugs. So wait, do you take that off completely?
I mean, the bezel's still back there. It's just sizing that hole that you cut out like really precisely, or undersizing that hole by like an inch on every side, and just adjust your game if you have to.
Also, you went around that with a beveled bit.
I did bevel the edge of this piece of plywood, so it's not a perfectly flat edge going in there. It's a little bit nicer.
I think we have that on a slide, maybe the next one. But yeah, so sometimes we'll just take a clear sheet of acrylic and put it over top of the screen to prevent anything from getting through the front. And that's done on a lot of the cabinets downstairs, just because like I would rather have a giant shield so nothing can actually get at the screen. Yeah, I guess it depends on your preference. So once you have the holes cut out, this has to get mounted to the cabinet, right? And it has to be strong enough to support the screen. So in this case, Kyle used these blocks on the side to affix the screen mount to the interior of the cabinet. And so once those were mounted, and then he cut little notches out for the power and the HDMI cables so that we could actually access them, and then we were able to mount the screen in the cabinet. Sound is really important. We've done sound all kinds of different ways. For this cabinet, we're cutting speaker holes into the panel over top of the screen. And we'll have 2 speakers mounted there, as Alan shows you. Generally speaking, we'll take a headphone out of the computer. We'll go into an amplifier, and I'll show you in a couple slides what that looks like. And then the speakers just have speaker wire going from the amplifier to the speakers. And then we need an access door because this is a big wooden box and you need to get inside of it sometimes. So we'll cut, similar to how we did the screen hole, we'll cut out a door out of the back panel. Kyle made a nice little handle, like an oval handle so he can get in, and put a hinge on the other side so it can open and close. We also have a little combination lock on the back so that when we come to events like MAGFest, we can lock it so that nobody else can open it up. All right. So that brings us to the console. So this was, like I said, this was split into 2 different jobs. And while Kyle opted to do the more analog method of cutting everything by hand, I wanted the console to be really nice and perfect. And so I worked with a CNC fabricator. A CNC machine is basically like a drill that's hooked up to a computer. You give it a digital file, and it can take a sheet of plywood, cut exactly what you want out of it. And so I had this file cut. It was the file at the beginning of the presentation. And it just makes sure all the joystick and button holes are super perfect so that they line up exactly where we want them. We decided to put cup holders in this console because we've been to a lot of events where people are putting drinks on the cabinets, and that's become less than ideal. So we give them a place to put their drinks so that we don't have to clean up liquid. Assembled the console. Once all the wood is screwed together and ready, then it's time for paint. So we used primer. And for those of you who haven't done any painting, if you paint directly onto bare wood, it absorbs the paint and doesn't look so great. So you have to use this white paint called primer, and it basically provides this nice smooth surface for the paint to adhere onto. So you do a coat of primer, and then you do a coat of paint. We have a lot of black arcade cabinets, and so we decided Kung Fu Kickball should be a different color. And we haven't done any red, so we wanted to make sure that this all was thematic with Kung Fu Kickball. And I think the closest color we found to the actual kickball was San Francisco 49ers red. Yep. So that's the paint we got. And so we painted the sides and the console. And then it's time for artwork. And so artwork can be done a lot of different ways. We've had artists do commissions. So on the Video Freak cabinet, we had an artist come in and just paint it freehand. We've done vinyl decals. We've done paper with like acrylic on top. And for this one, we wanted to try a super high, kind of thick vinyl so that we didn't have to worry about it getting ripped or replaced. So we went to another company who specialized in graphics. We sent them this graphic, and they came back with this really nice, thick adhesive decal. And you can come up and see it. It's on top of the console afterward.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. So once the decal was on, then we had to X-Acto all the holes so that I could install the buttons and joysticks. And so this is a pretty easy process. You just took an X-Acto knife, found where the holes were, cut a little circle, the cup holders, all the buttons. And then if you look at the second photo, this is the underside of all of the joysticks and buttons. And so how buttons work, there's like a little micro electronic switch that snaps into a plastic cylinder. And so you just put the plastic cylinder in, screw on a nut underneath, and snap on the electrical part. We chose Shimizu components for the buttons and joysticks. I know there's like a lot of opinions about Hap and Sanwa and what kinds of components. You can use whatever you want. I like to take into account the thickness of the wood because some buttons are really shallow. And so if you choose really shallow buttons and you put them in, you might not be able to thread on a nut underneath. So that's something I take into account all the time when I'm doing this. The joysticks on this were a little problematic. I didn't want to bolt them through the top because we had this really beautiful vinyl decal. So I opted to screw them from underneath. And I had to use really short wood screws for that because I didn't want the screws to come through and puncture through that really nice decal that we put on the top.
And one thing I just want to note about the joysticks, because this was new to me when I started doing arcades, is we often will think of joysticks almost like gamepads, like they kind of use for most console games, and they aren't. They're just 4 buttons, much like old consoles used to do. But so one of the things to keep in mind when designing these games is that they have to be basically like arrow key control. If they need analog input, you're not going to be able to get that level of kind of control about it. Yeah.
No, I'm just curious where you get your parts for your switches and your joysticks.
These were all ordered from Focus Attack. It's a website that sells arcade components. There's a lot of different vendors. Paradise Arcade is a Hawaiian-themed arcade vendor in Minnesota. I don't know why they're Hawaiian-themed. They're really great. They always send us like stickers and things.
The Starverse controls were from like a crane machine, right? They were like recycled from.
Yeah, because you wanted a button on the joystick, so
Yeah.
we needed that crane joystick to have
like,
that option.
If you feel like sourcing old parts, you can always find those being sold in random places.
eBay is also an amazing place for this kind of stuff because sometimes you'll find really rare joysticks and buttons, that aren't sold anymore.
A friend of the collective made an arcade cab using a controller from an M1 Abrams tank. It's a cab called Vec 9 in Chicago at Logan Arcade, but it's a very unusual controller, and it really hurts to use for too long because it's super heavy. Maniacs.
I forgot what I was going to say.
Sorry.
That's right. So basically the next step is getting everything wired up electrically. This is what I was going to say. So these joysticks are 4-way joysticks. Which means they're also 8-way joysticks because you can move them diagonally and get 8 directions. We have built a couple arcades with analog sticks. There's a company called Ultimark, which sells analog joysticks. They're about $75 each, so it can get really expensive to make an analog joystick cab. The nice thing about that is they just have USB cables, so you just plug in the joystick and you have an analog stick right out of the box.
They read as gamepads for the computer.
They also have 8 pins for buttons, so you can add those in. All right, go for it.
Do it.
Hey. It looks like a thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have like 12.6 arcade cabs in Death by Audio Arcade.
Just one thing to note about the analog joysticks, they are really cool, and some projects will basically require them, but just be aware that they are a much more fragile piece of technology. Like, these are literally just 4 buttons. You like almost have to work to break them, and the analog ones are a little more fragile.
At least the ones from Ultimark.
I think they're the only ones.
They might be the only ones. If anyone knows of any other analog joysticks, talk to us. So, this is this magical thing that allows us to use joysticks and buttons as key presses. This is also sold by Ultimark, and this is called an iPac. This isn't the only interface that will do this, but I find it's the most convenient one because it has software that comes with it. So you plug this in with a USB cable, you open up the software, and there's a line of screw terminals on either side. And basically you can put a wire in there, screw it down, and in the software you could say, this wire is the letter A, this wire is the letter Z. And you can just, in software, map it all. And then even if the computer powers down, it stores those settings. So it's sort of this, that's all you would have to do to make this work. They sell different versions of this. They sell larger versions for a lot of buttons. If you're making a 4-player cab with like 6 buttons each, there's not enough screw terminals on this. They sell an OptiPack. If you want to make one with trackballs, you can do that.
If you have 1,000 buttons, maybe, you like.
Yeah, so there's, you may have heard of Arduino microcontrollers or Teensy microcontrollers. They're also very similar to this, but you have to write some software on your own. So there's a little bit higher barrier to entry if you're not a good programmer, but you made a game. Yeah, this generally just works. So once you have the iPac installed, then it's time to wire everything up. So how an electrical circuit works is there's power and there's ground. The power has something like 5 volts running through it. The ground has 0 volts. So how the iPac reads these inputs is it says, is this connected to ground or not? And so a switch is basically a piece of metal that closes when you press it. So when you press a button, you're just touching 2 pieces of metal together. So what we have to do first is we have to connect ground to every button on the console so that it has that ground reference point. So if I push this button, it gets connected to ground. Yeah, it's loud. I use a lot of, I do a lot of wiring, so I like to solder. So I have a soldering iron, which is a really hot kind of iron that you could use to melt a material called solder, which can connect wires to other metal. But for this cabinet, I also did a couple things using crimp connectors. So if you don't want to use a soldering iron, or you don't have a soldering iron, you can buy these things, which just attach to the buttons, and you just close them with this clamp, and they hold the wire in place. I did about half with crimp connectors and half with solder. And if you get a closer look at the console, you'll be able to see how those all look. But you don't need to have a soldering iron. You can just crimp everything and it'll work perfectly fine. All right. This also gets really unruly, so I use zip ties to kind of keep every player's bundle of wires together. Otherwise, like, there's a lot of wires going on the inside, and you don't want to get things caught on each other. And then I use what's called a multimeter. This is an electrical tool that can tell you if things are connected together. And so I basically put one wire on the iPac, and the other one I touched to all the grounds to make sure that it made it all the way around to every button and every joystick. And I like to do this in advance, because if I plug in the software and a button's not working, I don't know if it's in the software or in the wiring or in the hardware. So this is a good electrical check before we get into software. And then we added some hinges. So there's this video. Let me see if it plays.
You could just go over there. And
Move all the way right.
Yeah.
No, be there. Yeah. What?
yeah.
Click it.
So the top was not connected to the bottom. So I got these nice hinges that allowed this to open and close. And these were nice because I didn't want this I didn't want the top piece to move back when it opened because I knew there was going to be a cabinet behind it. So we got hinges specifically that allowed it to open and still be, like, the wood would still be flush with the back piece. There's a lot of different kinds of hinges. We got these on Amazon. But they worked really well, so I actually had another set shipped to the Gaylord because I want to use them on more of our cabinets. Oh, yeah, we're over here. They're here, yeah. And then the Marquee. So that's this guy sitting in front of me. Dustin, you can hold back. So this is arguably the most important part of the cabinet. This is the art that everyone's going to see. It's going to be lit up. So it's important that this is done with a material that's semi-transparent. We've made marquees with opaque paper, which is really a bummer because
Don't do that.
You can't see the lighting behind it. Kyle, you had this just made at a local print shop.
Just a dude, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just a dude.
Some guy.
And this is adhesive. It's mounted.
Double-sided tape on the edges.
Hey. Oh, yeah. So this was taped with double-sided tape to acrylic. This is clear acrylic, so that this gives it some stability. It's not just a piece of paper. And we put all of our marquees behind acrylic just so that, you know, you don't get subject to elements or water or anything like that. And then this is just a little kind of LED light that plugs in and lights up the marquee from behind. These work really well. You can also get like those flexible LED lights. This one's nice because it also has like a soft setting. So let me see if I can kind of cycle through. Yeah, there's different kinds of lighting you can get out of this. You can get these at like IKEA or like hardware stores. And then this gets mounted to the top using some brackets. Do you guys, the builders, have any of those nice gold brackets that you made?
Sitting over there in the corner.
Oh, they're there. Yeah, Alan, right here on the table.
You guys.
So yeah, those were just aluminum brackets, spray painted gold, so they match the cabinets. And that was it for all the things that we did in advance, other than take apart the cabinet so we could rebuild it here.
You weren't supposed to say that part.
We also mount, these are the amp and speakers we use. This amp is by this brand, Lepy, L-E-P-Y. It's about $25 on Amazon. It takes a headphone jack in from a computer, and then there's these terminals on the sides where you can just attach speaker wire. And you can just cut speaker wire, clip it in there, and attach it to the back of the speakers. You can either solder it or crimp it to the speakers as well in the same way. And that's it for the fabrication, and then it's on to software. So this is what the iPac software looks like. It's unfortunately only for Windows and Mac, so if you're a Linux person, the iPac does not have an option for you yet, or you can just program it on a Windows device and then bring it over. But after you program it, it looks like a keyboard. So you just plug it in, and the computer will think it's a keyboard, and it does key presses. And then what we usually do for all of our computers is we'll set up the software on either a Windows PC, less and less Mac Minis, though we have done that in the past. And we set up the computer as an installation. So there's two blogs that we like. Andy actually wrote one.
11, there we go. No.
Here, just exit out of this.
No, I can just, should just yeah, here we go. Yeah, so there's we have two blog posts for it. One of them is mine. It is an updated version of a different post that was for Windows 10 or Windows 7. But so we have a Windows 10 guide. There is also a really good Mac guide. But the idea behind both of these is basically that modern computers are set up to just like jump and interrupt you a lot, and that's terrible for arcades because what we want is to plug the thing in and be able to walk away. Or more importantly, have someone who isn't us just be able to plug the thing in and walk away. So you have to turn off all the system notifications, you have to turn off any auto updates, anything that might interrupt the game or restart the computer or something like that. You also want to go ahead and set up the game to launch on startup. So you want to put that in the startup folder. You know, Mac and Windows both have some version of this, as well as removing everything else from the startup folder. And on Windows, I think I even have a script for it here. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things. We're going to post a link to this. Yeah, bypass the login screen. You can set the computer to shut down automatically. That one's pretty easy. You make a system event. You can also set the computer to turn on automatically at certain times by actually going into the BIOS. So you bypass the operating system. And there's some very, very simple things you can do on a low level on your computer, including things like turn itself on at 6 a.m. So you can get these things running pretty autonomously. We also use a program called Auto Hotkey, which I don't know if folks have heard of. It's very nice. It's a little scripting program that can just run in the background of Windows computers. So for instance, you could have it read the middle mouse click be, oh, that means look if there is an or a process with a certain name running, shut it down, and then launch that process again. So like a lot of our machines have little restart buttons in the back that are technically just wired to like a mouse button, but it'll let us, if like the game freezes, just kill it, relaunch it, that kind of thing. So you can do a lot there to just make the thing a lot more robust without really anyone noticing who's playing it.
We also, we work with a lot of venues who aren't technically savvy. So just to be able to be like, here's a button in the back. If this is broken, just tap it, and it'll start up back into the game.
Yeah, you can provide a guide with your arcade machine to whoever's running it, and if it's more than like maybe one bullet point, they're just not going to read it. So you want that to be as simple as possible.
Also, it's nice if you build something that you just plug in and it boots up. So having the BIOS work, having it just start up when it gets power is really nice.
Quick philosophical note. I think one of the joys of doing physical arcade games like this is that they just kind of seem like a box of magic, and like all this stuff kind of makes it even more so.
This is a tiny link to that Windows 10 blog if you want to read it. And we'll compile all this info and post it on deathbyaudioarcade.com later today, so you can go back and read about it.
But
we'll post the link on social media. So follow us on that.
To Dustin's point, it really does kill the magic if you just see like a Windows start screen on an arcade machine. So it's nice when you can avoid it.
We also have this cost breakdown, which I have here. I just got to bring it over here. So this was divided almost equally between Kyle, Jonah, and I when it comes to expenses. Let me see if I can blow these up a little bit.
Yeah, I could make a quick note about the machine I found. So I also got it at Micro Center. I just said, give me the cheapest thing you got with the HDMI out, and because my game is pretty low resource usage, so it ran fine on that. And they give you like a refurbished thing, comes with like a mouse and keyboard, like everything you need all in one box.
Yeah. So we spent, if I scroll down here, we spent about $1,000 on this. And obviously the most expensive things, the computer, the monitor, these were both about $130, $140. Getting the cabinet CNC'd and getting that vinyl graphic printed, these were pretty expensive. So you can cut costs by just kind of doing everything yourself. We decided to splurge a little bit on this console because we just wanted it to look really nice. And then the electronics were about $100. I don't think there's really any way around that. You can kind of skimp on like $12 joysticks, but if you want the good stuff, it's going to cost some money.
Money is defined as like $18.
Question right here.
Yeah, where do you typically get your vinyl decals done?
So this one was a new company called Very Direct, and they're a professional vinyl printing company in New York. But you can go to like Kinko's and get kind of a heavy stock, even for the Marquee, that looks pretty nice. So like there's FedEx Kinko's everywhere, and you can just tell them like, I want to backlight something, and they'll have paper for you. You can get adhesive things. Side decals are really expensive. Jonah, you found that website.
Yeah, I forget what the name is now, but we can like add it to the links or something later. There's like
Yeah.
$100 for 2 side decals or something.
Yeah, it's really cheap. We haven't used it yet, but I'm curious to see the quality on it. $100 seems like too good to be true, so I don't know how the quality is going to be, but there are places out there that print like full side art. And then you can get it and just like trim it with an X-Acto knife when you put it on.
Your local print shop also, if you have a local print shop, a lot of them will have vinyl. Even if they'll do like
Yeah, local print shops are cool.
So let's see what happened to
You just got to close your spreadsheet.
Another question?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I can't see you.
That's fine, that's fine. I'm just curious, how do you deal with heat issues though if you're using a PC? Like it seems like everything's a very closed system, so there's not a lot of space to vent heat in around.
Yeah, I think that depends on the PC. Some of them have fans built into the power supply. We have vents in different places.
Usually just there's enough venting coming from like the back door having like, you know, a little bit of a gap that it hasn't been a problem. I think there's only been one situation where we had overheating. So we've kind of just not put a lot of work into controlling heat and gotten away with it so far.
It's
if you're going to be doing an arcade exhibit in like, I don't know, a desert, like you definitely want to put more work into it. We haven't done that because it hasn't come up enough.
I mean, also, it's 90% an empty box, right? Like, the PCs we use are really small. This is actually a much bigger PC than we would usually use. So having all that extra space in there does a lot for the heat dissipation.
I was just going to say, on our cabinet, there are output vent holes that are cut really low, and so we would just line our computer up with those. So the output fans on the computer just vent right through those holes. So you can sort of like the hole that Kyle cut for the handle, cut the small ones so that low, and that people exit the cabinet.
Yeah. I think the only time we had heat issues was, yeah, like a huge sweaty party with no
big
air
warehouse
conditioning.
party that was extremely hot in the middle of the summer.
Yeah.
And the venue itself also had no ventilation, so you have a bunch of boxes inside of a giant box with no ventilation anywhere. Fun times.
Well, also compared to the old systems and the CRTs, we have LCDs and Raspberry Pis and stuff. A lot of this is still a lot of heat by itself. So there's a big reduction using newer components and LEDs.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, Moore's Law has given us a lot of just better efficiency. It's helped a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up Raspberry Pi, which is a really good point. So if you don't know, like a Raspberry Pi is a little $40 single chip computer that runs off of an SD card, which is really amazing, except for Unity games that don't compile for the Raspberry Pi. So, you know, where we could have saved all this money by using a single chip computer, unfortunately, the ARM processors that they use, they won't run games in Unity. Though your game, because Dustin, you built it in assembly, will run on a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
So you can get away with it. Also,
If
like,
you know assembly.
if you're building a MAME and just doing emulation, a lot of those can run on a Raspberry Pi. So you could probably build a cabinet for the Retro Pi and save a lot of money on the computer.
You can run a lot of things on Raspberry Pi. It's just Unity. It's I mean, can you make an HTML5 game or something, you know?
Have you bothered with the coin slots at all?
So we do have coin slots on a lot of our machines. That's actually fascinating how they work. There's a mechanism that uses the weight and diameter of the coin to determine if it's the correct coin. And then if it is, it drops it on top of an electrical switch. So you can wire that right up to the iPac, and every coin drop can register as a different key, which is really handy. But since we run a lot of our games in free play, a lot of the coin slots aren't even wired up.
And part of the reason for that is just that we've been nomadic for so long. Like, we're usually just working with a venue, and the events are run more like a gallery show or something like that than like a normal for-profit arcade. So we haven't had the incentive yet to make coin doors actually working and hooked up, but maybe eventually.
There's also on a website called Adafruit a programmable coin door. So if you wanted to make custom tokens, you can train it on these tokens so that you can use those instead. Other questions? Yeah, over there.
Have you guys ever built a pedestal? And do you have any opinions on that? Like a pedestal or cabinet? You basically don't have a top that you connect to a TV on the wall or something like that.
Salmon roll a little bit.
Do you mean? Are you talking about like a cocktail table or?
No display in the cabinet.
Oh, no display.
No, like the way like some like Big Buck Hunter and like Golden Tee games work, right? Am I correct about that? Yeah.
So like take the top half off the Starbursts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've built some consoles. There was a developer who made a game called Moonfields, and he just wanted a two-player control console. And that was just basically this part with the joysticks and buttons and the iPac, and that's it. because that's just USB, and he could just use that instead. You don't really need the whole cabinet.
Typically, when we've done things like that, we don't have a computer in there. It's just the controller, and then it gets plugged into a computer and a monitor or something.
Yes.
Another question. So, have you guys ever plugged one on caster?
So a lot of our cabinets are on casters, and they had been on casters, but I think it was MAGFest 2 years ago where we came down in the morning and they had all been pushed like across the room. So we were like, we need either casters with brakes or we just have hand trucks. And so having hand trucks is great because you just put the cabinet down, it doesn't move, that's where it is, and they're really easy to move around that way.
So what casters did you guys use? Some of them that kind of breaks.
I think the casters, the ones with brakes, are off of a website called McMastercar. It's basically a hardware wholesaler online, and they do all sorts of nuts and bolts and things. Maybe like $12 each, so 12 times 4 casters. They get really expensive if you want, or really cheap. So.
Yeah.
You were saying the iPac can't run Unity. What can run Unity?
Oh, no, not the iPac. Raspberry Pis.
Yeah.
The iPac is basically a keyboard. The computer just thinks of it as a keyboard, so it'll work with anything you could plug a keyboard into, basically.
The programmer only runs in Windows and Mac, though. So, yeah, but that's just a one-time setup thing. So you can run it on anything you want after that.
Okay. What microcontroller does run like with Unity games, though? Do you have any idea?
I mean, the Udo?
So wait, I think
I'm sorry, did I misunderstand the question?
So the question is what like single board computer can run Unity? So this is kind of this emerging field, and so there's new stuff that's coming out. We got one from Italy called the Udo, which we put Ubuntu on, and since it's an x86 operating system, it will run Unity games. But usually we're using a Windows or Mac for the game itself, just because like you can find a $150 Windows computer generally, like especially a tower that no one wants, and if it's just running the game, it tends to work out.
Also, Unity on Linux is somewhat experimental, but support is improving. So.
Yeah.
What was the, did you say you found the initial plans that you then modified somewhere, or were those your original?
I usually just Google arcade cabinet designs, and you can see them all. There's like 3D files, there's like all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and then we'll pick one and go off of that.
Based off of like the specs you went for.
Yeah. And then we'll make a SketchUp file so that we know the exact dimensions for everything in advance.
I think we only have time for one more question, if there's one more to finish up. Going once?
Yeah, we got one.
Oh yeah, this will be in the MIVS area next to the Kung Fu Kickball booth. And then the rest of our cabinets are right across from that, so you can see how we've evolved through the years from really bad cabinets to less bad cabinets. Cool.
I guess that's it. So,
all right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And we are going to be running a tournament for Star Versus, that game on the CRT, in about half an hour. So.
Oh, and there's a tournament for Kung Fu Kickball on Saturday at 1:30.
Everyone have a great MAGFest.